June 10, 1940. The earth trembled beneath the weight of 59 tons of German engineering as a Panzer IV rumbled through the burning streets of a French village whose name would soon be forgotten to history. Inside the steel coffin, 5 men breathed recycled air thick with cordite and sweat, their faces illuminated by the eerie glow of instrument panels. They were not monsters, not yet. But war has a peculiar way of transforming ordinary men into architects of devastation. Hauptmann Klaus Richter pressed his eye against the commander's periscope, watching French civilians scatter like autumn leaves before a storm. At 32 years old, he had already witnessed the lightning conquest of Poland, where German panzers had first demonstrated their terrifying efficiency. The doctrine they followed, blitzkrieg or lightning war, was not merely a military strategy, but a philosophy of total mechanical dominance. According to military historian Dennis Showalter's research documented in Hitler's panzers, the German armored divisions represented a radical departure from traditional warfare, combining speed, firepower, and radio communication into a weapon that could paralyze entire armies. The panzer crews called themselves Stahlmörder, steel killers. It was not a name bestowed by propaganda ministries or glorified in newsreels. Rather, it emerged from the crews themselves, born from the grim recognition of what they had become. Human extensions of their machines, dealers of industrial-scale death. These men operated at the cutting edge of mechanized warfare, where split-second decisions determined whether villages stood or burned, whether enemy columns retreated or were annihilated. Richter's crew consisted of men from every corner of the Reich. His driver, Gefreiter Hans Müller, was a farmer's son from Bavaria who could coax their panzer through terrain that would trap lesser machines. The gunner, Unteroffizier Friedrich Weber, had been a factory worker in Essen, his steady hands now calibrating death rather than assembling machinery. The loader, Schütze Otto Brenner, barely 20 years old, moved with mechanical precision born from endless drilling, and the radio operator Obergefreiter Ernst Vogel maintained their lifeline to command while manning the hull-mounted machine gun. They had entered France on May 10, 1940, as part of Generaloberst Heinz Guderian's 19th Corps, the tip of the spear that would slice through the Ardennes forest and shatter the Allied defensive line. The French and British had expected the main German thrust to come through Belgium, a repeat of the Schlieffen Plan from the First World War. Instead, Guderian's panzers had achieved what Allied commanders deemed impossible, pushing hundreds of tanks through the impassable Ardennes, creating a breakthrough that would lead to one of history's most stunning military defeats. The effectiveness of these armored divisions stemmed not from superior technology. French tanks often boasted thicker armor and larger guns, but from doctrine and coordination. German panzer tactics emphasized concentration of force, independent action by junior officers, and the integration of infantry, artillery, and air support. Each tank crew trained relentlessly until operating their vehicle became instinctive, a deadly dance performed in cramped metal confines where one mistake could transform their panzer from hunter to tomb. As Richter's panzer advanced deeper into France that summer afternoon, the commander contemplated the strange duality of his existence. He was simultaneously a cog in history's most efficient military machine, and an individual man capable of mercy or cruelty. The choices he made in the coming months would help define not just his own fate, but the meaning of mechanized warfare itself. The village ahead still smoldered, and somewhere in the distance, enemy guns awaited. September 1, 1939. The story of Germany's steel killers truly began not in France but in Poland, where the world received its first glimpse of what armored warfare could become. Richter, then a lieutenant, had commanded a Panzer III in the assault on the Mlawa line, where Polish cavalry and obsolete fortifications crumbled before the German advance. The campaign lasted only 35 days, a testament to the devastating effectiveness of combined arms tactics that would become Germany's signature. The Polish campaign revealed both the potential and the problems of panzer operations. German tanks frequently outpaced their infantry support, creating dangerous gaps in the advance. Radio communication, though revolutionary, remained unreliable. Mechanical breakdowns plagued the columns, with nearly 30% of German armor temporarily disabled by maintenance issues rather than enemy action. Yet these teething problems were outweighed by stunning tactical successes. At the Battle of Bzura, German panzer divisions encircled and destroyed the largest Polish counteroffensive, demonstrating the lethal efficiency of mobile warfare. Richter remembered his first kill, a Polish 7TP light tank that had emerged from a tree line near Piotrków. His gunner, a different man then, one who had not survived the campaign, had fired 3 rounds before scoring a hit. The Polish tank had burned with surprising intensity, black smoke rising in a column visible for kilometers. Richter had felt nothing in that moment, his mind entirely focused on the next threat, the next target, the next decision. Only later, in the quiet hours before dawn, did the weight of what he had done settle upon him. The German Panzerwaffe, armored force, evolved rapidly between the Polish and French campaigns. Training intensified, tactics were refined, and new equipment entered service. The Panzer IV, originally designed as an infantry support vehicle, began receiving improved armor and more powerful guns. Crews drilled endlessly on gunnery, driving, and the complex choreography of loading, firing, and target acquisition that separated elite units from merely competent ones. According to research preserved in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum archives, the German military's effectiveness rested not solely on equipment, but on a military culture that emphasized initiative, adaptability, and what the Germans called Auftragstactik, mission-type tactics that granted subordinate commanders considerable freedom in achieving objectives. A panzer commander like Richter did not wait for detailed orders. He assessed the situation and acted, trusting that his decisions aligned with the overall operational intent. Weber, Richter's gunner in France, had joined the crew shortly before the Western offensive. A precise, methodical man, Weber approached gunnery as a craft requiring constant refinement. He calculated range, elevation, and target movement with mathematical precision, factors complicated by the fact that panzer guns of 1940 lacked sophisticated fire control systems. Everything depended on the gunner's skill, experience, and ability to work as one with his commander. The relationship between tank commander and gunner paralleled that of a surgeon and nurse, intimate, based on absolute trust, often wordless. Richter would identify targets, estimate range, and issue firing commands. Weber would acquire the target through his telescopic sight, make minute adjustments to the gun's elevation, and fire. In combat, this sequence occurred in seconds, repeated dozens or hundreds of times as enemy tanks, anti-tank guns, and fortifications appeared and disappeared in the chaos of battle. Muller, the driver, sat in the hull's front left, separated from the turret crew by the massive engine and transmission. Driving a panzer required not just skill, but physical endurance. The steering mechanism demanded constant manipulation of 2 brake levers, each requiring significant force. Engine noise made communication difficult even with the internal intercom. Visibility through vision slits was severely restricted, forcing drivers to rely on the commander's directions while simultaneously processing terrain, obstacles, and threats. As the crew prepared for the French campaign, they had no illusions about invincibility. They had seen enough destroyed German tanks in Poland to understand their vulnerability. May 13, 1940. The breakthrough at Sedan shattered more than French defensive lines. It shattered the illusion that the Maginot Line and traditional military thinking could contain Germany's mechanized juggernauts. Richter's Panzer Division crossed the Meuse River under a sky darkened by Stuka dive bombers, their sirens screaming psychological warfare as effectively as their bombs delivered physical destruction. The French defenders, already demoralized by days of constant air attack, broke when German armor began emerging on their side of the river. This moment represented the culmination of German armored theory developed over 2 decades. After the First World War, forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles from maintaining large military forces, German officers had studied mechanized warfare obsessively. They analyzed British tank operations at Cambrai, read the works of theorists like J.F.C. Fuller and Basil Liddell Hart, and conducted secret training programs in the Soviet Union. The result was a comprehensive doctrine that viewed tanks not as infantry support weapons, but as independent operational forces capable of achieving strategic objectives. Richter's panzer pushed west from Sedan with a speed that astonished both German high command and Allied intelligence. Guderian's corps advanced 50 kilometers in 24 hours, then another 50. French commanders, accustomed to the methodical pace of First World War operations, could not comprehend what was happening. Their intelligence reports placed German spearheads impossibly far forward. Surely these must be reconnaissance units, not main combat formations. Yet the reports were accurate. The panzers had achieved operational surprise through sheer velocity. Inside Richter's tank, the crew operated in a state of exhausted alertness. They had been in continuous combat operations for 72 hours, pausing only for fuel, ammunition, and hurried maintenance. Muller drove with his eyes burning from strain, navigating by Richter's terse directions while avoiding obstacles invisible through his limited vision slits. Weber engaged targets with mechanical efficiency, destroying French tanks, anti-tank guns, and anything else that threatened their advance. Brenner, the loader, hauled 30-kilogram shells from storage racks to breach with clockwork regularity, his young face streaked with powder residue. The human cost of this advance remained largely invisible to the panzer crews. They saw destroyed enemy vehicles, abandoned equipment, and occasionally prisoners being marched to the rear. What they did not witness were the streams of refugees clogging French roads, the civilian casualties from Luftwaffe attacks on retreating columns, or the desperation spreading through Allied ranks as their armies disintegrated. War from inside a tank offered a peculiarly filtered perspective, violent yet limited, intimate yet detached. By May 20, 1940, German panzers had reached the English Channel at Abbeville, completing an encirclement that trapped the British Expeditionary Force and the best French armies in a pocket around Dunkirk. Military historians would later identify this as one of warfare's most decisive maneuvers, comparable to Hannibal's encirclement at Cannae or Napoleon's victories of movement. The Allied armies, despite possessing more tanks than Germany and controlling greater industrial resources, had been outmaneuvered and outfought. Richter's division participated in the reduction of the Dunkirk pocket, though Hitler's controversial halt order on May 24th gave the British precious days to organize their evacuation. The reasons for this decision remain debated. Göring's promise that the Luftwaffe could finish the job, concerns about tank losses in marshy terrain, or Hitler's political calculation that Britain might sue for peace if not utterly humiliated. Whatever the cause, over 300,000 Allied soldiers escaped across the Channel, living to fight another day. For the panzer crews, the French campaign ended with a curious mixture of triumph and anticlimax. They had achieved the impossible, conquered France in 6 weeks, avenged the humiliation of 1918. Yet the war continued, and already new challenges loomed. Britain remained undefeated, and whispers circulated about operations in other theaters: North Africa, the Balkans, perhaps even the Soviet Union. Richter's crew received Iron Crosses in a hasty ceremony behind the lines, medals pinned to dusty uniforms by a general whose name they immediately forgot. February 14, 1941. Erwin Rommel arrived in Tripoli with orders to stabilize the North African theater, where Italian forces had suffered catastrophic defeats against numerically inferior British Commonwealth troops. With him came the first elements of what would become the legendary Africa Corps, including Richter's reformed Panzer Regiment. The Steel Killers were about to enter a very different kind of warfare, one where heat, distance, and logistics mattered as much as tactical skill. Richter's Panzer IV received modifications for desert operations, improved air filters to combat the omnipresent sand, additional fuel and water storage, and tropical uniforms for the crew. The tank itself became an oven during daylight hours, with interior temperatures exceeding 50 degrees Celsius. Metal surfaces grew hot enough to cause burns. The crew learned to conduct maintenance during the cooler hours of dawn and dusk, working by flashlight to preserve their vehicles. The British Eighth Army proved far more formidable opponents than the French had been. Their Matilda tanks boasted armor that German 50mm guns could barely penetrate, forcing Richter's crew to aim for tracks and flanks. British anti-tank guns, particularly the versatile 2-pounder, exacted a steady toll on German armor. Moreover, British commanders like General Wavell demonstrated tactical competence that belied their initial defeats against the Germans. Rommel's first offensive in March 1941 caught the British completely by surprise. The Afrika Korps advanced with characteristic speed, recapturing all the territory Italy had lost and besieging the vital port of Tobruk. Richter's battalion participated in the dash across Cyrenaica, a 700-kilometer advance in 2 weeks that rivaled the pace of the French campaign. Yet North Africa's distances were deceiving. Conquering territory meant little when supply lines stretched across waterless wastes and every drop of fuel had to be shipped from Europe. According to accounts documented in The Path to Blitzkrieg by Robert Citino, published by Lynn Reiner Publishers, the German operational method in North Africa exemplified both the strengths and weaknesses of their approach to warfare. German forces consistently outmaneuvered their opponents, achieving tactical victories through superior coordination and aggressive leadership. However, they struggled with the prosaic realities of logistics. Every liter of fuel, every shell, every replacement part had to cross the Mediterranean under constant threat from British aircraft and submarines, then traverse hundreds of kilometers of desert road. Richter experienced this reality firsthand during the siege of Tobruk. His Panzer battalion spent weeks probing the fortress defenses, engaging in sporadic combat that achieved nothing decisive while consuming irreplaceable fuel and ammunition. The crew endured sandstorms that reduced visibility to meters, heat that turned their tank into a torture chamber, and the psychological strain of seeing comrades' vehicles destroyed by mines, artillery, and the increasingly effective British anti-tank tactics. The desert also imposed a strange intimacy on the combatants. Battles occurred in defined areas surrounded by vast empty spaces. Both sides relied on the same supply routes and watering holes. Captured enemies were treated with relative respect, partly from shared suffering in the harsh environment, partly from the recognition that roles might reverse tomorrow. War in North Africa retained an almost sporting quality, a deadly game played by professionals who held no particular animosity toward their opponents. Weber, Richter's gunner, developed an almost supernatural ability to spot enemy tanks in the shimmering heat haze. His eyes, already strained from years of squinting through gun sights, adapted to reading the subtle distortions that betrayed a distant vehicle. June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, began with the largest military assault in history. Over 3 million German soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, crashed across the Soviet border along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Richter's regiment, hastily redeployed from North Africa, joined Army Group Center in its thrust toward Moscow. The Steel Killers were about to enter a dimension of warfare that would test them beyond anything previously imagined. The initial advances resembled the French campaign. Vast encirclements, hundreds of thousands of prisoners, seemingly unstoppable German progress. Richter's Panzer Battalion participated in the encirclement battles at Minsk and Smolensk, grinding through Soviet defenses with brutal efficiency. Yet even in these early victories, troubling signs emerged. Soviet tank forces included new models, the T-34 and KV-1, whose armor and armament shocked German crews. Richter first encountered a T-34 near Smolensk, watching in disbelief as his gunner's shots bounced off its sloped armor, while the Soviet tank's 76mm gun destroyed 2 German Panzer IIIs. The T-34 represented a paradigm shift in tank design. Its sloped armor provided protection equivalent to much thicker vertical plates, its wide tracks distributed weight effectively across soft ground, and its powerful diesel engine offered excellent mobility. German tank crews discovered that their standard 50mm and 75mm guns could only reliably penetrate T-34 armor at close range, turning encounters into desperate knife fights where the first hit usually proved decisive. Soviet resistance, though often disorganized due to Stalin's purges of the officer corps, demonstrated a ferocity that German soldiers had not encountered in Western Europe. Red Army troops defended positions to the death, launched human wave counterattacks, and displayed a willingness to accept casualties that stunned German commanders. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed, yet new formations appeared with demoralizing regularity, filled with men and equipment from the Soviet Union's vast interior. Richter's crew adapted to the new conditions with difficulty. The distances in Russia dwarfed even North Africa's expanses. Villages consisted of wooden structures that offered no cover against tank fire. Roads became impassable seas of mud during autumn and spring, a phenomenon called rasputitsa that paralyzed mechanized forces. Winter brought temperatures of -40 degrees Celsius, freezing engine oil, snapping metal stressed by cold, and causing frostbite that claimed fingers and toes. The nature of combat on the Eastern Front differed fundamentally from the West. German forces fought not just the Red Army, but also partisan units operating behind German lines, imposing a permanent state of insecurity. Atrocities became commonplace as ideological warfare merged with military operations. SS Einsatzgruppen followed the army, murdering Jewish populations and communist officials. The Wehrmacht, including panzer units, became complicit in crimes that violated every principle of military honor. Richter witnessed events that would haunt him forever. Villages burned in reprisal for partisan attacks, civilians executed on suspicion of collaboration, Soviet prisoners left to starve in makeshift camps. His own hands remained relatively clean. Tank commanders focused on military targets, leaving occupation duties to infantry and security forces. Yet knowledge of these atrocities and the choice to remain silent constituted its own form of guilt, a moral compromise that corroded the soul. By December 1941, Army Group Center stood within sight of Moscow's spires, but could advance no further. The Soviet winter counteroffensive, launched when German forces were exhausted and overextended, drove them back in confusion. Richter's battalion suffered 50% casualties during the retreat, losing tanks to mechanical failure, lack of fuel, and increasingly effective Soviet tactics. The myth of German invincibility died in the snow outside Moscow, though the killing would continue for 3.5 more years. The crew dynamics within Richter's panzer shifted during the Russian campaign. Müller, the driver, grew increasingly fatalistic, performing his duties with mechanical precision while speaking rarely. Weber developed a nervous tic, his hands trembling during rest periods though steady when operating the gun. July 5, 1943. The Battle of Kursk represented Germany's last major offensive operation on the Eastern Front, a massive armored assault designed to pinch off a Soviet salient and regain strategic initiative. Richter's regiment, now equipped with the new Panther tank, participated in the northern pincer attack as part of Model's 9th Army. The Steel Killers were about to discover that their technological edge had finally evaporated. The Panther represented Germany's response to the T-34, incorporating sloped armor, a powerful 75mm high-velocity gun, and improved mobility. On paper, it was the finest tank in the world. In practice, the rushed development meant chronic mechanical problems. Transmissions failed, engines caught fire, and final drives broke under stress. Richter's crew spent as much time maintaining their temperamental vehicle as fighting it, a situation replicated across the Panzerwaffe. The Soviets knew the German attack was coming. Soviet intelligence, aided by the British Ultra program breaking German codes, provided Stalin with detailed information about German plans. The Red Army prepared the most comprehensive defensive system ever constructed, with multiple lines of trenches, anti-tank ditches, minefields, and thousands of artillery pieces. Soviet tank reserves waited in carefully prepared positions, ready to counterattack once German momentum dissipated. Richter's battalion entered the Kursk salient on July 5, immediately encountering fierce resistance. Soviet anti-tank guns destroyed German armor with methodical efficiency. Minefields channeled German advances into killing zones. Sturmovik ground attack aircraft swarmed over panzer columns, dropping bombs and firing rockets. The supposedly decisive German breakthrough became a slow, grinding attrition battle that consumed irreplaceable men and machines. The technical sophistication of German equipment no longer guaranteed victory. Soviet tank crews, tempered by 2 years of brutal combat, had become skilled professionals. Soviet tanks, though individually inferior to Panthers and Tigers, appeared in overwhelming numbers. Soviet artillery, employed in massed batteries that the Germans called firestorms, plastered German positions with devastating effect. The Red Army had transformed from the disorganized force of 1941 into a modern military machine capable of matching German tactical excellence. After 2 weeks of fighting, having penetrated barely 12 kilometers into Soviet defenses while suffering catastrophic losses, Hitler canceled Operation Citadel. The decision marked a watershed. Never again would Germany possess sufficient strength to mount a major offensive in the east. From Kursk onward, German forces fought a long defensive battle, trading space for time while hoping for political salvation that never materialized. Richter's crew survived Kursk, though their Panther did not. On July 14, 1943, a Soviet anti-tank shell penetrated the Panther's side armor, starting a fire in the engine compartment. The crew bailed out seconds before ammunition began cooking off, destroying the tank. They watched from a shell crater as 2 years of German engineering excellence burned, black smoke rising into a sky contested by Soviet aircraft. The battalion received replacement Panthers within a month, but the vehicles came without corresponding replacements for lost crew members. Richter's tank now included 2 inexperienced replacements, a new loader who had never seen combat, and a radio operator transferred from a destroyed unit. The veteran corps of Muller and Weber remained, but the crew's coordination had been disrupted. Building the wordless understanding necessary for effective combat operations would take months of training they did not have. The retreat from Kursk began in August 1943 and never truly stopped. German forces conducted a series of fighting withdrawals, delaying actions, and desperate counterattacks as the Red Army advanced relentlessly westward. The nature of combat shifted from mobile warfare to defensive battles centered on river lines, urban areas, and fortified positions. Panzer units, designed for offensive operations, became firefighters rushing from crisis to crisis, attempting to plug gaps in collapsing defensive lines. Richter witnessed the Wehrmacht's slow disintegration from the inside, January 15, 1944. The Soviet winter offensive shattered Army Group Center, creating a gap in German lines that Soviet mechanized forces poured through with devastating effect. Richter's regiment found itself encircled near Vitebsk, fighting desperately to break out while Soviet armor tightened the noose. The Steel Killers had become the hunted, experiencing firsthand the terror their enemies had felt during the triumphant years. The encirclement at Vitebsk revealed how completely the strategic situation had reversed. German forces, once mobile and aggressive, now fought from static positions with dwindling supplies. Soviet forces employed the same encirclement tactics that had brought German victory in 1941, but with greater resources and improved execution. Soviet tank columns bypassed German strongpoints, striking deep into rear areas to sever supply lines and create chaos. Richter's Panther fought in the breakout attempt, engaging Soviet tanks at ranges where German gunnery superiority still mattered. Weber destroyed 4 T-34s in succession, his practiced eye finding weak points in their armor with mechanical precision. Yet for every Soviet tank destroyed, 3 more appeared. The mathematics of attrition had turned decisively against Germany. Soviet factories produced 30,000 tanks annually, while German production struggled to replace losses. Every German tank destroyed was irreplaceable. Soviet losses could be absorbed and overcome. The breakout succeeded barely, with Richter's battalion losing 60% of its armor in 3 days of continuous combat. The survivors retreated westward through devastated landscapes where German occupation had transformed villages into moonscapes. Richter saw evidence everywhere of what German forces had inflicted on Soviet territory: burned buildings, mass graves, populations reduced to starving refugees. The realization slowly crystallized that Germany was now reaping what it had sown, that the brutality visited upon the Soviet Union would return with interest. Müller died during the retreat, killed when a Soviet shell penetrated the driver's compartment while they moved through a forest track. Richter, in the turret above, heard his driver's brief scream before silence. The crew could not retrieve Müller's body from the mangled hull. They had to abandon the Panther and fight as infantry until reaching German lines. The loss devastated Richter more than any previous casualty. Mueller had been with him since France, 1940, a steady presence through 4 years of war. The replacement crew Richter received reflected Germany's manpower crisis. His new driver was 16 years old, conscripted from the Hitler Youth with minimal training. The loader came from the Luftwaffe, a former ground crew mechanic with no tank experience. Only Weber remained from the original crew, and even he showed signs of psychological strain, nightmares, difficulty sleeping, a 1,000-yard stare that had become common among veterans. By summer 1944, the Eastern Front had become a charnel house consuming German forces with insatiable appetite. Operation Bagration, the Soviet offensive beginning June 23, destroyed Army Group Center completely, eliminating 28 divisions and killing or capturing 350,000 German soldiers. Richter's regiment participated in desperate rearguard actions during the retreat through Belarus, fighting to keep escape routes open while the Red Army pursued relentlessly. The character of combat had coarsened beyond recognition. Both sides shot prisoners routinely, burned villages suspected of harboring partisans, and treated civilians with casual brutality. The rules of war, always tenuous on the Eastern Front, collapsed entirely as German forces retreated through territories they had terrorized during occupation. Soviet troops exacted revenge with enthusiastic thoroughness, treating German prisoners and civilians with the same savagery Germans had displayed advancing eastward. Richter found himself making decisions he would once have considered unconscionable. When his tank column passed through a village where partisans had ambushed a German supply convoy, he ordered the village burned, without investigating which civilians might be innocent. When Soviet prisoners were taken during a skirmish, he looked away as SS troops led them into a forest from which they never emerged. The moral framework that had guided his early war years eroded under the pressure of survival and the normalization of atrocity. Faber finally broke during a firefight near Lviv in July 1944. After destroying 2 Soviet tanks, he suddenly stopped responding to commands, staring blankly at his gun sight. Richter had to physically shake him to restore awareness. That evening, Weber was evacuated to a field hospital, diagnosed with combat fatigue never to return. January 12, 1945. The Vistula-Oder offensive began with a Soviet artillery barrage of unprecedented intensity, thousands of guns pulverizing German defensive positions along the Vistula River in Poland. Richter's regiment, now part of the desperate defense of the Reich's eastern approaches, occupied positions near Warsaw. The Steel Killers had been ground down to a shadow formation. 12 operational tanks where once there had been 100, crews composed of boys and old men led by a handful of exhausted survivors. The Soviet advance achieved breakthrough on the first day, smashing through German lines with overwhelming force. Richter's Panther engaged Soviet tanks from a hull-down position, using superior optics and gunnery to pick off T-34s at extreme range. His crew now consisted entirely of replacements except himself, teenagers who had never seen combat before being thrown into the war's final convulsions. They performed adequately, testimony to Germany's training system still functioning even as the nation collapsed. The retreat across Poland occurred in chaos, with German units disintegrating under Soviet pressure, while millions of German civilians fled westward ahead of the Red Army. Richter's regiment attempted to cover civilian evacuation columns, fighting delaying actions that bought hours at the cost of tanks and lives. The futility was obvious. Soviet forces would reach Germany proper regardless of German resistance, yet military discipline held, and soldiers continued fighting. By February 1945, Richter's regiment had been pushed back into Pomerania, defending territory that had been German for centuries. The crew witnessed streams of refugees, women, children, elderly, trudging westward through snow, fleeing Soviet advance. Some carried belongings, most had nothing but the clothes on their backs. German military columns mixed with civilian refugees, creating traffic jams that Soviet artillery and aircraft attacked indiscriminately. The Red Army soldiers Richter occasionally encountered as prisoners or brief conversations during local truces had changed from the desperate defenders of 1941. They were confident, battle-hardened veterans of a victorious army, well-equipped and determined to carry the war into Germany itself. They spoke matter-of-factly about retribution, about making Germany pay for the destruction visited upon their homeland. Richter understood that mercy would be a rare commodity in the coming months. On March 19, 1945, Richter received orders to retreat to Berlin. His regiment had been reduced to 5 operational tanks. Fuel was critically short, ammunition scarce, replacement parts non-existent. They abandoned 2 tanks that broke down during the retreat, crews joining those of remaining vehicles in overcrowded interiors. The journey to Berlin took 5 days, following roads clogged with retreating military units and refugees, constantly harassed by Soviet aircraft. Berlin in April 1945 resembled a surreal nightmare. The capital of the Reich that had once dominated Europe was being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing and Soviet artillery. Richter's regiment received defensive positions in the city's eastern suburbs, where they would make their final stand. The crew knew survival was unlikely. Urban combat negated most advantages of armor while magnifying vulnerabilities. Tanks in cities became targets for short-range infantry anti-tank weapons, launched from windows, basements, and ruins. The Battle of Berlin began April 16, 1945, with the massive Soviet assault on the Silo Heights, the last natural barrier before the capital. Richter's tank fought in the city's outskirts, engaging Soviet armor at murderously close range amidst burning buildings and rubble-choked streets. The crew destroyed 7 Soviet tanks in 2 days before running out of ammunition. Unable to withdraw, fuel exhausted, escape routes cut, they abandoned their Panther and fought as infantry. Richter led his teenage crew through the devastated city, attempting to reach German lines that no longer existed in any coherent sense. They sheltered in basements while Soviet artillery pounded the ruins above, shared scraps of food with terrified civilians, and witnessed the final collapse of Nazi Germany. On May 2, 1945, when the Berlin garrison surrendered, Richter and his crew were captured by Soviet troops. The Steel Killers' War ended in a prisoner of war camp in eastern Germany, where Richter spent 3 years before repatriation. May 8, 1945. The war in Europe ended officially, though for Richter, captivity was just beginning. The Soviet POW camp near Poznan held thousands of German prisoners in conditions that ranged from harsh to deadly. Richter watched men die from dysentery, starvation, and the psychological trauma of defeat. The teenage crew members he had commanded in Berlin's final battle clung to him as a father figure, seeking meaning in the catastrophe that had consumed their youth. The camp's Soviet administrators showed particular interest in Panzer veterans. Interrogators questioned Richter repeatedly about German tank tactics, equipment specifications, and operational methods. He answered truthfully. What purpose did secrecy serve now that Germany lay in ruins? The interrogators were professional, even respectful, treating the former Panzer commander as a fellow military professional rather than a war criminal. This courtesy did not extend to SS prisoners, whose fates Richter preferred not to contemplate. During long months of captivity, Richter had time to reflect on his 5.5 years as a steel killer. He calculated that his various crews had destroyed perhaps 60 enemy tanks, countless anti-tank guns, and inflicted casualties that numbered in the hundreds if not thousands. What did these statistics mean? Were they achievements to take pride in, or merely accounting entries in history's ledger of violence? The moral clarity he had possessed in 1940 had long since dissolved, replaced by ambiguity and guilt. The question of complicity haunted him. Richter had never personally murdered civilians, had not participated in SS atrocities, had even occasionally helped refugees when opportunity allowed. Yet he had served faithfully in a military that enabled genocide, had fought to prolong a regime guilty of unprecedented crimes, and had witnessed atrocities without taking meaningful action to prevent them. Was passive acquiescence to evil less culpable than active participation? The philosophers and theologians who would debate these questions for decades ahead offered Richter no comfort. Other prisoners dealt with defeat differently. Some embraced victimhood, insisting they had merely followed orders, that ordinary soldiers bore no responsibility for Nazi crimes. Others retreated into fantasy, claiming Germany had been betrayed by weak leaders or that eventual vindication awaited. A few acknowledged their role in catastrophe, accepted responsibility, and began the painful work of moral reconstruction. Richter found himself in this last category, though acceptance brought more anguish than denial might have provided. News filtered slowly into the camp about Germany's transformation. The country had been divided among Allied occupiers, its cities reduced to rubble, its population devastated by war losses and expulsion of ethnic Germans from eastern territories. The Nazi regime's full criminality emerged through newsreels of liberated concentration camps, testimony at the Nuremberg trials, and the documented evidence of industrial-scale murder. Richter learned that his nation had not merely lost a war, but had been complicit in evil of almost incomprehensible magnitude. The knowledge was crushing. Richter and millions of German soldiers had believed they fought for national survival, to defend the fatherland against Bolshevism and Allied aggression. These rationalizations crumbled when confronted with evidence of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and the systematic murder of 6 million Jews alongside millions of other victims. The war Richter had fought with professional competence had enabled genocide. His skill, dedication, and courage had served monstrous purposes, regardless of his personal motivations or moral restraint. Among fellow prisoners, reactions varied wildly when confronted with evidence of the Holocaust. Some refused to believe the reports, dismissing them as Allied propaganda. Others acknowledged the facts but insisted the Wehrmacht had remained clean, that only SS and party officials bore responsibility. A few, like Richter, recognized that distinctions between clean and dirty military service collapsed when the entire enterprise served genocide. The Wehrmacht had facilitated the Holocaust through conquest, occupation, and active cooperation with killing squads in occupied territories. In autumn 1946, Richter witnessed something that crystallized his transformation. A Soviet officer screening prisoners for release interviewed him about his wartime service. When Richter mentioned serving on the Eastern Front, the officer, a Ukrainian, asked matter-of-factly whether Richter had seen what Germans did to his village. The officer described returning home in 1944 to find his family murdered, his village burned, the population scattered or dead. He spoke without anger, stating facts as he might report weather conditions. Richter had no memory of that particular village, but he remembered dozens like it. The officer's story could have described 100 locations where Richter's regiment had passed through or operated near. Whether Richter's own hands had pulled triggers mattered less than his participation in the machinery of destruction. The Soviet officer recognized this, yet spoke to Richter with neither hatred nor desire for vengeance, only a weary acknowledgement of what had occurred. "War makes monsters of us all," the officer said in broken German. "You were a good soldier for a bad cause. Now you must be a good man for whatever comes next." The Soviet officer approved Richter's repatriation in spring 1947, 3 years after his capture. Richter returned to a Germany that existed only as an occupied territory divided between competing powers. His hometown in Saxony fell within the Soviet occupation zone, making return impossible. He settled instead in Bavaria, in a displaced persons camp that gradually transformed into a permanent resettlement community. The physical Germany Richter found bore little resemblance to the nation he had known. Cities lay in ruins, infrastructure destroyed, the population traumatized and exhausted. Millions of refugees from lost eastern territories overwhelmed communities struggling to provide basic necessities. The occupation authorities, American in Bavaria, maintained order while German institutions slowly rebuilt from rubble, both literal and metaphorical. Richter discovered that most of his immediate family had survived, though scattered across occupied zones. His parents had died during the war, his mother in an Allied bombing raid, his father of illness exacerbated by malnutrition. 2 brothers had fallen in combat, one in Normandy, another in Italy. His sister survived, living with her children in Hamburg, her husband missing somewhere in Soviet captivity. The war had not destroyed his family entirely, but had shattered it beyond restoration to pre-war wholeness. Employment proved difficult for former Wehrmacht officers. Denazification procedures examined every German's wartime activities, assigning categories ranging from exonerated to major offender. Richter, Evaluated as a follower due to his military service but lack of party membership or documented crimes, could seek work but faced social stigma. He found employment eventually as a machinist, his mechanical aptitude translating from tanks to civilian machinery. The teenage crew members from Berlin's final battle pursued different paths. The young driver, having survived imprisonment, emigrated to Argentina, joining thousands of Germans seeking fresh starts in South America. The loader returned to his family's farm, never speaking of the war again according to letters they exchanged briefly. Others Richter had commanded over the years disappeared into post-war anonymity, their fates unknown. Weber, the gunner who had suffered breakdown in 1944, Richter located in 1949 through veteran networks. Weber lived in a psychiatric facility, still suffering severe combat trauma that rendered him unable to work or maintain normal relationships. Richter visited occasionally, sitting with his former comrade in silence or discussing neutral topics, never mentioning tanks or warfare. Weber died in 1953, officially of pneumonia, though Richter suspected the man had simply lost the will to continue living with his memories. May 10, 1955. Richter attended a ceremony in Bonn where the newly formed Bundeswehr, West Germany's reconstituted military, inducted its first soldiers. The occasion provoked conflicted emotions. Germany needed defense forces given Cold War tensions, yet watching young men swear military oaths recalled too vividly how such oaths had once bound Germans to catastrophic evil. Could military service exist divorced from political purposes? Could soldiers remain morally clean when institutions they served pursued immoral objectives? The Bundeswehr, carefully designed to avoid Wehrmacht failures, emphasized democratic values, civilian control, and individual moral responsibility. Soldiers could refuse illegal orders, officers received education in ethics and law, and the force structured itself to prevent military adventurism. Whether these safeguards would prove adequate remained uncertain, but they represented serious attempts to learn from history's lessons written in blood across Europe. Richter never joined the Bundeswehr despite recruiting approaches recognizing his expertise and experience. He could not wear uniform again, could not command men in vehicles designed for killing, regardless of cause or context. His talent for mechanized warfare remained, but the will to employ it had been extinguished in Berlin's ruins and Soviet prison camps. Others made different choices, with former Wehrmacht officers forming the Bundeswehr's professional corps. But Richter's war had truly ended in 1945. The 1950s brought Germany's economic miracle, reconstruction transforming ruins into prosperous communities with astonishing speed. Richter participated in this transformation through steady work, rebuilding life with the same methodical dedication he had once applied to tank maintenance. He married in 1952, a widow whose husband had fallen in Russia. They had 2 children, a son and daughter, whom Richter raised with conscious effort to instill values that transcended nationalism and military glory. Conversations with his children about the war proved extraordinarily difficult. How could he explain his service to Nazi Germany without either glorifying it or appearing a moral monster? How could he convey that ordinary men became complicit in extraordinary evil through small compromises and gradual normalization of atrocity? He tried to emphasize that good intentions proved worthless when serving evil purposes, that personal honor meant nothing without moral courage to resist unjust commands and causes. His son, born in 1953, grew up in a Germany determined to forget its immediate past while building a democratic future. The younger generation asked uncomfortable questions their parents often deflected. What did you do in the war? Did you know about the camps? Why didn't Germans resist? Richter answered honestly when asked, neither minimizing nor exaggerating his role, accepting responsibility while avoiding self-flagellation that might seem performative. Veterans organizations formed during the 1950s, groups that varied wildly in character. Some promoted reconciliation and peace, genuinely grappling with Germany's crimes and seeking atonement. Others descended into apologetics, claiming victimhood and portraying Wehrmacht service as honorable regardless of the regime served. Richter avoided most veteran gatherings, uncomfortable with both self-righteous condemnation and defensive minimization of German guilt. He maintained correspondence with a few former comrades who shared his perspective, men who acknowledged the war's criminality while wrestling with their participation in it. These letters discussed not tactics or battles but moral questions without clear answers. Could professional competence absolve complicity in unjust causes? Did fighting bravely for wrong purposes constitute honor or shame? These debates continued across decades, never resolved, because no resolution existed that could satisfy both conscience and memory. In 1961, the Israeli government captured Adolf Eichmann, architect of the Holocaust's logistics, and put him on trial in Jerusalem. Richter watched the proceedings with horrified fascination. Eichmann's defense, that he had merely followed orders, functioned as a bureaucratic cog, held no personal animosity toward victims, struck Richter as both false and disturbingly familiar. The excuse of just following orders had been Germany's collective rationalization, yet Eichmann demonstrated where that logic led when pursued without moral restraint. The Eichmann trial prompted renewed discussion in Germany about collective responsibility and individual guilt. Richter participated in community discussions, acknowledging Wehrmacht complicity in Holocaust while distinguishing between active perpetration and passive facilitation. The distinction mattered legally but offered cold comfort morally. His generation had failed catastrophically to resist evil, whether through action or inaction, seemed less important than the fact of failure itself. As Richter aged, passing through his 60s and 70s, he devoted increasing time to education. He spoke at schools, sharing experiences with students who knew World War II only from textbooks. His message remained consistent: that ordinary people become complicit in atrocities through conformity, fear, and rationalization. That professional competence without moral compass serves evil as readily as good. That military glory divorced from just purposes becomes ash and dust. The speeches were difficult, exposing wounds that never fully healed. Describing his service meant acknowledging participation in catastrophic evil, accepting that his skills and dedication had prolonged a genocidal regime, however unintentionally. Students sometimes asked if he felt proud of his military accomplishments, the tactical victories, the decorations, the reputation as an elite tank commander. Richter answered truthfully, he felt neither pride nor shame in military competence divorced from moral context, only sorrow that such abilities had served monstrous purposes. November 9, 1989. Richter, now 76 years old, watched television as the Berlin Wall fell, and Germans celebrated reunification. The barrier that had divided his nation for 44 years crumbled before crowds wielding hammers in joy. He wept, not from nationalist sentiment but from relief that perhaps Germany's division, punishment for unleashing World War II, might finally end without provoking new catastrophe. The reunified Germany that emerged inherited complicated legacies from both East and West. Western prosperity and democratic institutions combined with Eastern experiences under Soviet-imposed communism, creating a nation that acknowledged historical guilt while attempting to forge a peaceful future. Whether this new Germany had truly learned history's lessons remained uncertain, but its commitment to democracy, human rights, and European integration offered hope that the cycle of violence might finally break. Richter lived to see the new millennium, dying peacefully in 2003 at age 90. His obituary, appearing in local newspapers, identified him as a World War II veteran and machinist, mentioning neither his decorations nor his service in the Panzerwaffe. His family honored his request for a simple funeral without military honors, understanding that he had spent 6 decades trying to reconcile the young man who served as a steel killer with the older man who recognized the profound moral bankruptcy of that service. His grandchildren inherited boxes of letters, photographs, and written reflections documenting his journey from confident tank commander to troubled veteran grappling with complicity in history's greatest crime. These materials eventually found their way to archives preserving German wartime experiences, adding one man's testimony to the historical record. Richter's story offered neither redemption nor damnation, but rather an honest accounting of how ordinary men became instruments of extraordinary evil and spent their remaining years seeking atonement that could never fully come. The steel killers of Germany's Panzerwaffe demonstrated tactical excellence and professional competence in service of a regime guilty of genocide and aggressive war. Their story encompasses both impressive military achievement and profound moral failure, a combination that resists simple judgment. Understanding their experiences requires acknowledging both their humanity and their complicity, recognizing that the distance between ordinary soldier and war criminal often proves far shorter than comfortable mythology suggests. The tanks Richter commanded rusted decades ago in scrapyards and museums, their steel transformed into monuments or recycled into peaceful purposes. The men who crewed them, the Müller, Weber, Brenner, and countless others, returned to dust, their individual stories largely forgotten except in family memories and archival records. What remains is the historical lesson their experiences teach: that technical skill without moral purpose serves evil as readily as good, that following orders does not absolve responsibility, and that confronting uncomfortable truths about past complicity represents the first step toward ensuring such catastrophes never recur. Germany's steel killers were neither heroes nor simple villains, but rather ordinary men who became extraordinary killers in service of genocidal evil, then spent their remaining years attempting to understand how that transformation occurred and what it revealed about human capacity for both excellence and atrocity. Their legacy endures not in military glory, but in the sobering recognition that the greatest dangers emerge not from obvious monsters, but from competent, dedicated professionals who serve monstrous purposes without adequate moral resistance. The lesson remains eternally relevant: that every generation must choose whether to resist injustice or facilitate it, and that professional excellence divorced from moral courage becomes not virtue, but dangerous complicity in whatever evil our institutions pursue.